And today is the 1st of May. It's Labor Day around the world. And normally today we tend to see how workers around the world come out and have their own march on the street to try to voice their concern about their labor costs, about their difficulty in living their life. But this year it must be unprecedented for all workers around the world as well. And right now we have Kun Andrey Sawchenko, Regional Vice President of Forced Labor Programs Asia Pacific from International Justice Mission. Good evening, Kun Andrey. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, and good evening to you, Kun Nata and Kun Tapchai.
Good evening, Kun Andrey. So there isn't much to celebrate on this Labor Day this year, right? Given the shutdown, the impact from the economic downturn. So in general, I think the workers all the world over, face more sufferings than they already have.
Absolutely right, Kun Tapchai. And so it's just my honor and privilege. While we can't get out on the streets, we can raise our voices from wherever we are. And it's a privilege to be able to highlight the fact that while workers have made advances for many years, migrant workers especially are under a particular strain and stress during this COVID-19 response.
So what's the difficulty you got report from migrant laborers? Can you just give us some examples?
Well, sure, and I think just want to highlight that the lockdown situations, while it definitely in the best interests of the full society, and of course we're in full support, but we just have to recognize that the lockdown actually makes some people more unsafe, and so some examples of that would be people who are domestic workers. Many domestic workers have been working longer hours during this time, and actually many have experienced withholding of pay, lower pay. We know that there are many workers who are forced to go to work but with inadequate protections, leaving some situations of outbreaks in migrant worker communities. We can think of the or we can think of the Singapore situation. Of course, we also know migrant workers just as well as anybody else. Some of them face situations of domestic violence and abuse, and I think we should always recognize in this situation that people facing particularly gender-based violence at home are under extreme risk, higher risk at this time.
But do you think authorities in countries, at least countries in this region, are paying attention to the plight of the workers as you have just outlined? They understand the difficulty they're facing, but
Absolutely,
Please,
we see a good response, and I'm so happy to see in Thailand that we have some really good measures the past few days, including even just today the release of a hotline for migrant workers to be able to 1422 to be able to call in and voice their own concerns, and even have response in different languages available to migrant workers, especially Myanmar, Cambodia, and Lao PDR. So that's really progressive, and we know that the governments have been trying to get more registration of migrant workers so that there's better access to medical care, and to make there have been made some exceptions to the need to do immigration office visits to be able to extend visas. So we definitely appreciate that. We know there's been a lot of concern, especially since the Singapore second outbreak was really focused in the housing facilities where migrant workers were living. And so I think that was really a wake-up call that governments in the region need to pay attention to not only the factories, but maybe even more so the living conditions and living facilities of places where the migrant workers have been at. So certainly much has been happening, but we want to highlight the fact that migrant workers continue to be at risk for forced labor, and even more so during these times.
Yeah.
And what is mechanism by IJM in order to help those migrant workers or domestic workers who are facing even more difficulty during this lockdown, Kun Andrey?
Yeah, thank you. So IJM's plan is to work together with governments and support governments. We know governments have the rightful role and duty under the laws in each country here in the ASEAN region. Strong laws for worker protection do exist, and so our goal is to help governments in seeing the consistent and regular enforcement of those laws so that workers can really be fully protected. That would include good labor inspections, good police investigations in case of any cases found where there may be problems, good worker protections through any of those processes, safe and fair return to home where workers can and want to do that. So IJM's approach is very much partnership with government and other NGOs to help those who have suffered through applicable legal processes and get them back to safety and protection back home.
Andrey, as you know, that the population of migrant workers in Thailand is quite huge and not much different from what happens in Singapore. They cram into dormitories or houses, living quarters. And of course, I mean, there has been question raised about the level or extent of testing for coronavirus among these migrant workers. Do you have any observation on that?
Well, I think testing is a limitation all over the world, and testing is something that all countries are looking to ramp up. I do think that when we're not testing, we're definitely leaving ourselves vulnerable to transmission that will only later be found out. So we would definitely point to the need to continue to increase testing, particularly in migrant communities. And I think the thing to point out about migrant communities is that although the government has been trying to get the word out that they don't have anything to fear from getting medical testing or support, but in fact there's a widespread and deeply held belief in migrant communities all around the region that if they do come forward to authorities that they might find themselves being detained somehow or deported. There's a great fear of coming in touch with government officials from many migrant communities. And so that's why we really advocate for more testing to be done in migrant communities and in collaboration with those migrant communities so that there can be increased trust and not fear.
Are these migrant labor the first group to be left behind in this lockdown situation? How do you see it? Because right now we can see clearly economic impact happening in many countries around the world, Thailand, Singapore, and local people tend to get assistance. But what about migrant laborers?
Well, it is going to be a reality that migrant laborers are going to feel the pinch most acutely. I think for sure the economic stimulus measures and the economic enhancement policies in all of the countries in the region are going to focus on citizens. As arguably, that's something that I think would have widespread public support. And yet the economies of these countries have been built on large part of migrant labor support in the past couple of decades. And so we would want to see that governments and businesses would take care of those migrant workers who have helped them build the businesses. And I would say that law enforcement officials should be extra vigilant at this time to watch out for any who would cut corners and abuse the most vulnerable workers among us.
In what particular sector or what industry concerns you the most regarding the situation of migrant worker?
Yeah, I think it's the same sectors that have the highest vulnerabilities already. The low skill worker sectors that, and particularly those that are outside the main view. So things like the fishing industry, the agriculture industry. Of course, the domestic service industry, all of the industries that are are more difficult to inspect and access and dispersed in rural areas. Those are the industries that have been traditionally hard to regulate and oversee. And as a result, we have seen in those environments that higher rates of forced labor have existed. And so I think during this environment when everyone's under pressure, we are going to see at least the possibility of increased rates of forced labor and human trafficking because we just have higher rates of vulnerability. So we'd want to look at those industries first.
Andrey, there is one aspect of the shutdowns that few people in Thailand have talked about. You mean shutdowns in many countries mean that more children will be spending more time at home, right? Of course, the children don't mind, they're more than happy about that. But that means that they would be spending more time online and thus exposing themselves to people with criminal minds who want to prey on them for whatever reason. I mean, trafficking or sexual abuses. I'm sure that IJM has a lot of concern about this issue.
A huge concern, Kuntepchai, and so we absolutely know and actually are seeing increased rates of people preying on children for online sexual exploitation during this season. And it's absolutely incumbent on authorities to consider the protection of the most vulnerable to be one of the priorities or one of the parts of the COVID response. Certainly we all agree with and understand the need for frontliners in the public health community to be highly prioritized, but I would also think that protection of the most vulnerable sectors that can be preyed on during this time is also very much an issue. And I do think in Thailand there are children at risk online because there are those who are willing to prey on them and they will take advantage of the opportunity.
And what could be the most important factors or stakeholders in trying to help in this situation?
Well, the police actually, and the law enforcement officials and social welfare officials in all the countries in ASEAN have plans, have programs, have strategies to proactively find where the most vulnerable people are and to follow up rigorously on cases. And I'd say we have seen some of that. In fact, in an IJM involved case in the middle of March, we saw the DSI rescue 5 fishermen, and that was right as this shutdown was just beginning, so we were very encouraged by that. We saw the PAMA officials here take extra efforts to accommodate those individuals into the shelter after they were properly tested, and really work hard to try to accommodate the enforcement of laws and the protection of the most vulnerable people even during the lockdown. So we were encouraged by that and would just want to see more of the same. Really, it's the same kind of activities to watch for the most vulnerable, take in reports, and then follow up on reports very thoroughly. I think there's as to children online, there are trained law enforcement officials around the world who are scouring the internet for these kind of abusers and looking to follow up on them. And I know Thailand has its own counterparts here in the Royal Thai Police who are looking to do an excellent job and keep up with it. So we fully support them and look to resource them as much as possible in the days and months to come.
Andrey, but for the vulnerable, it must be very challenging for them or very difficult for them to break the silence because they are being treated unfairly or being abused in the family. And how could they gather all the courage to try to tell police officers?
Yeah, it's heartbreaking and it's horrible, and that's why the public needs to know more about these possible issues so that more people can report cases on behalf of those children, and that as soon as someone does speak up, that there's action immediately and reliably for those children. Absolutely. These crimes are done in the darkness, they're done in secrecy and privacy, and I think it's incumbent on all of us to watch out for the children in our communities, and if any of them is brave enough to speak up, to follow up to the fullest extent to protect those children. Absolutely.
Do you-
Andre, you think the pandemic and the impact on the economy on the migrant workers will anyway be sort of a wake-up call for governments in this region, at least, I mean, to rethink their, migrant workers' policies?
Yeah, let's be optimistic. It's Labor Day today, and I think so. I think there's a widespread recognition that migrant laborers are the backbone of the economy in this region, and so we all should do our best to make these places where there's sustainable long-term industry that is good for workers and good for business and good for the countries as a whole to continue the upward trajectory of growth. And coming out of the COVID situation, there's going to be pressure, but there's a real opportunity to kind of do a reset on our migrant labor policies and see more access to government benefits and even access to form unions and labor unions and other organizing tools to raise their voices. We really think that this is an opportunity to make the ASEAN region even more of a driver of the next century or this century in the economic growth because the migrant laborers are here and want to work, and if we can find ways to treat them in sustainable ways, I think that there are good things in store.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed, Andrey, for sharing your thoughts on migrant labor, especially during this lockdown with us. Thank you very much.